And we're back for part two. This second half is going to very quickly rip through a fairly complex political landscape and try and make it at least passingly comprehensible, so that when you come across some of these strange party names or militia names or whatever you want to say, that they do make some kind of sense to you. Alright, so we're looking at the nationalists and Republican sides in the Spanish Civil War, and I've titled this slide Red Flags or Red and Black because there's some very subtle distinctions between party insignia that denote really big distinctions between political philosophies. So pay attention to which acronym pops up where, because they're going to be pretty significant. Now, one of my favorite parts about getting to teach this part of history is the fantastic propaganda posters that were produced during that era. There's some great modernist works of art. Later on in the term, we'll look at, we'll spend a little bit of time looking at Picasso's Guernica as well, which is another very famous piece of modernist art that was produced. But I like these popular modernist depictions of political themes that have got simple slogans on them. You can see this one here, two soldiers, one representing on the left the Spanish Republic, the other representing on the right the International Brigades, which we'll talk about in a second. And the slogan says something to the effect of the unity of the armies of the people are a weapon for victory, which is nice and simple, a good thing to motivate the workers in a time of national crisis. Alright, so let's start with the Republic. In the lead up to the Spanish Civil War, going right back to the fall of the Roman Empire, Spain or its precursor kingdoms were monarchies. After a period of pretty significant political turmoil, in 1931 the monarchy was on its last legs. The king abdicated after a number of political problems, and went into exile elsewhere in Europe, I think in France from memory, although I could be wrong about that. Spain became a republic, and remember that a republic is any form of government at all, really. Anything that isn't a monarchy is technically a republic. In this case, it became a republic that was increasingly moving towards democratization. In the national elections of the 1930s in Spain, that was the first time in which women were permitted to vote in a democratic election in that country. So a lot of the traditions of the old monarchy were thrown off, and when the Republic was founded in 1931, and this is the flag of the Republic that you can see there, the crown doesn't represent a kingdom. It's the coat of arms of the Kingdom of Castile. I think I'll have to double check that too, and you can see the coats of arms of the other component kingdoms of Spain there as well. And the slogan Plus Ultra, which means yet further. Alright, so in this republic though, as in all new states, there are a number of different people and groups of people who are jostling for power. Firstly, we have the monarchists, and I'm going to deal with the nationalist factions first, or the factions that would end up on the nationalist side, and then I'm going to move on to the Republicans. So the monarchists does what it says on the box, and you'll see that their flag on the right there is pretty familiar. It's the current Spanish flag. The monarchists represented tradition and a kind of a feudal approach to relationships. Many people who identified as monarchists were big traditional landowners who came from noble families. A lot of them owned big estates, especially in the south of Spain. And a lot of those big estates had a lot of people attached to the land who, even though it was 1931, 32, all the way through to 36, were for all intents and purposes peasants in the truly medieval sense of the word. They'd been attached to that piece of land for generations. Monarchists were also, because they're traditionalists, traditions tend to cleave together, and so they were big supporters of the church, that is to say the Catholic Church as well. And speaking of which, we have here the Theta. This is the Catholic Party. The C, obviously, you got to lisp your way through it when you're doing Spanish. The C obviously stands for Catholic. That's the right-wing Catholic Party. One of the big things, among other reforms, but one of the big things the Spanish Republican government did when the king abdicated and more progressive parties gained power was they started to engage in pretty radical reforms of the education system. Previously, the Catholic Church had been in charge of most education in Spain, and the Republican government shoved them out of that position of advantage and turned education into a state concern instead. And so they enlisted hundreds of thousands of enthusiastic young people in the early 20s to go and be school teachers, an enthusiasm that I can only assume didn't last very long. All right, so the Theta is a conservative Catholic organisation. They're big on slowing down the pace of reform and returning to traditional values. The Phalange. All right, you'll have to excuse my Spanish. All right, a lot of English speakers will just say Phalange, and that's quite acceptable as well. It's a word that translates to phalanx in the ancient Greek sense of the word, and in the sense of being a single unit focused on a single objective, and being a very homogenous group of people. Now, the Phalange is the fascist movement. You're familiar with the fascists of Italy and the Nazi Party of Germany. This was the local equivalent. Fascism is big about, let's say, unity, singularity of purpose, and the appeal to tradition, but not always for traditional ends. And so the fascists, or the Phalangists in Spain, aligned themselves loosely with the Catholics and monarchists, but many of these fascists were quite radical in the sorts of changes they wanted to make to Spanish society. And so they weren't necessarily convinced Catholics or monarchists themselves, although quite often they were. Lastly, the Spanish army. The Spanish army had been defeated time after time ever since the Napoleonic Wars at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. And over the course of the 19th century, Spain had lost all of South America, most of the Caribbean, and finally all of the Caribbean when it was defeated by the United States in the Spanish-American War. It had lost the Philippines, it had lost Guam, it had lost parts of North Africa, and just within living memory at this time, it was fighting a desperate war in what is now Morocco to try and keep control of that last little piece of Spanish colonial territory. So the Spanish army represents the old Spain in many ways, the Spain that used to be great, but which now is in decline. And many of the officers in particular, and remember that the officer class is the same as the landholding class in many cases. So many of the officers come from big traditional conservative families, and they see the decline of the Spanish Empire, the decline of the monarchy, the decline of the church, and the growth of these uppity workers' parties as all sides of the same coin. and they think that if you can arrest the development of one of those things, then you can arrest the development of all of them. And so they'd like to see an end to this sort of messy Republican government and the reinstatement of some top-down order. And they don't really care where that order comes from. On your right there, you can see the man from whom that order will emerge. That's Francisco Franco. And he, after the nationalists were victorious in the Spanish Civil War, he stepped up to serve as Spain's dictator right up until 1975. So if you think that fascism is a political force that ends with, Hitler and the Führer bunker in 1945, well, there's evidence to the contrary right there. Before I move on to the Republican forces, I'm going to pause this video here, and the summary of the Republicans will be in a third and final part.